I'm going to talk to Mark Zacharias, who's the Executive Director of Clean Energy Canada, about an op-ed that he and a colleague had published in the Vancouver Sun last week about what happens if Shell and, well, the LNG Canada group just goes ahead and green lights phase 2, which will require, it has to be electrified in order for BC to make its climate commitments, which would require 3 Site C dams worth of power, if you can imagine. And Mark and I are going to play one of my favorite games, which is where the hell is British Columbia going to get all its power in the future? And this LNG Canada kind of brings that question to the fore. So welcome to the interview, Mark.
Great. Thanks very much. Thanks for having me.
Like, this is just a serious issue. This drives me crazy because BC, I live in BC, you live in BC, and this government is sleepwalking we're going to have an electric future when we don't know where the electricity is going to come from. And it's craziness. So let's start with LNG Canada's. The scuttlebutt is that it's going to be greenlit. It's going to get a final investment decision probably early in 2023. And so this becomes real in a hurry.
Yeah. Well, and it just happens to be LNG Canada phase 2 is the large project, probably closest to a final investment decision. And what we found in our work, and again, this is all based on publicly available information in BC Hydro's integrated resource plan. Anybody can go download it. And what we found is that just to meet BC's climate targets by 2030 would require another 12% of electricity, or equivalent to about 1.5 Site Cs. And then on top of that, if LNG Canada phase 2 were to electrify the upstream, so where oil and gas is produced at the wellhead, the midstream, you need compressor stations to actually move gas along a pipeline to the coast. And then its phase 2 plant, another 1.5 Site Cs would be required. So, very quickly, you're looking at the question of where does the power come from? And again, it doesn't have to be LNG. This could be a large green hydrogen plant running on electricity that has been proposed in BC, and it would also use similar amounts of power. So yeah, you are absolutely correct.
Now, before we get into the where the hell is BC going to get the power from game, you brought up something that doesn't get discussed nearly enough, and that is when I talk to companies that are locating plants like battery plants and so on, I say, what's at the top of your locating list? Like, what are you looking for? Clean electricity, abundant supplies of clean, affordable electricity. And so if BC says, John Horgan said when he was premier, we want these battery plants, we want critical minerals refining, we want green hydrogen, all of which are incredibly electricity intensive. So if you're going to do LNG Canada 2, phase 2, and you want to go ahead with all of these other sort of clean energy industry, and then we're all going to be switching to electric cars and heat pumps in our homes, and we're going to do that in commercial buildings and so on. The math just doesn't even come close to making sense. And the government, nobody is talking about this.
Absolutely. And it's not a unique problem to BC. If you look at Ontario in Windsor, they recently had to pass on a $2.5 billion investment for a battery plant because there was not sufficient electricity and not sufficient infrastructure to power the plant. And we're looking at what we call it the opportunity cost, is we do not have enough electricity. Meanwhile, we want to build new mines that will provide the metals and minerals to electrify our economy. And we want to export clean hydrogen, whether it's from natural gas or whether it's from electrolysis. But again, all of that requires electricity. We have individual families moving to heat pumps, moving to electric cars. We are decarbonizing our industry. We have industry moving away from using natural gas, moving to use more electricity. And, the old days, which was even a couple of years ago, we would just buy on the spot market from the Western grid, whether it's California right up through BC. And again, every one of our trading partners is in a similar situation right now where they're starting to look at shortfalls as their economies decarbonize.
Now, 2 years ago, Bruce Ralston, the energy minister in BC, this issue came up, and he said, we'll just buy cheap California solar, because at that time, California was curtailing a lot of its solar power. It couldn't use it, during the peak and during the day, peak production during the day. So, we'll just do that. I said, I'm going to test that hypothesis. And so I interviewed Ben Kuyala, who is a utility planner in Oregon. I interviewed Elliot Maines, who at that time was head of Bonneville Power Power Administration, is now the head of Casio, their independent system operator. And then I interviewed another economist whose name I can't remember. Every one of them said, look, it's okay in the short term as long as we're producing all this crazy amounts of solar. BC could, but then there's a whole bunch of reasons why that will never work in the long term. A, we want to use the solar power ourselves. We're putting in battery storage and hydrogen plants and all sorts of other stuff. B, there's not enough storage capacity down the number 5 corridor, and building transmission capacity these days is like a 10 or 15-year job if you can get it done. It's very difficult. And we're having a drought, so the chances are that we're going to need that power ourselves because our hydropower generation is going to go. There's a whole bunch of reasons why relying on our coastal neighbors down in the U.S. is a terrible idea, and yet the government seems that it wants to persist with this.
Yeah. And BC Hydro's plan is to make up any shortfalls. About half of that power would come from spot purchase buys from our neighbor. We also have an opportunity in BC that hasn't yet been fully realized. We have about kind of 900 megawatts of independent power projects that exist today that are coming up for renewal. And a lot of them have Indigenous ownership or equity stakes in them. So there's an opportunity there. BC Hydro has proposed to build some large stationary storage batteries, which again is probably a good idea. But again, it's 450 megawatts, which is not a whole lot in the grand scheme of things, looking at the amount of power that's going to be required. And then, of course, there is kind of conservation, demand side management, smart grids, microgrids. So there's a bunch of other technological solutions. But as you say, already California, just this past summer, almost ran out of power. And if it wasn't for a last minute emergency alert from the governor's office saying, please turn off your appliances, they might have had some fairly large brownouts or blackouts. So we are already at that tipping point. And the other piece too, I think you mentioned it, it's really important to keep in mind, is in a changing climate, our hydrograph changes, how much water occurs where. We have areas of drought that are expanding both in geography and in timing. And, just energy planning gets that much harder.
Yes, and I want to talk about the independent power producers, because that was brought in a big way under the BC Liberals. And there was a lot of criticism about some of the contracts they entered into. Now, most of those contracts, I've been through the documents, and they, it was a competitive process, and they got prices that were reasonable at the time. Around, some of them were $60, $70, $80 a megawatt hour, not 100. But what happened when the NDP took power in 2017 is they made a political choice to politicize the independent power producers. They had a consultant write the ZAPT report, and they absolutely just demonized the IPPs, liberal buddies, and cronyism and corruption and all of that. And what they've done is they poisoned the well. Now it's really hard to go back and say, oh, no. Now we need power. We're going to talk to the IPPs and see if they'll invest capital and expand their power generation. British Columbians are going to look at them like, what? You just told us 5 years ago these guys are horrible, and now you want to do business with them? I thought it was a very, very short-sighted decision at the time.
Well, and I think you add that to the pile of good ideas at the time. And Kathleen Wynne ran into this in Ontario as well, as where, she stood up a lot of renewable power assets at a time when, they were quite expensive relative to what you can procure those for today. Alberta in the last couple of years they're getting wind at 4 cents a kilowatt hour now. That's among the lowest in all North America, and much cheaper than you'd find in any other source, including hydro and nuclear. So the opportunity is out there to stand up renewable assets. And, I think the question is going to be is, how many of these existing legacy IPPs can now produce power for that level and that amount? So I think, yet to be determined. I think too is, several years ago, there was a looming power overhang. It looked like we had too much electricity right through the entire West Coast. but how quickly that changes as, immigration levels change, as people start decarbonizing, as industry starts demanding more and cleaner power. And I think you brought this up at the outset too, is, Canada's economic secret sauce is clean power. And if you look at, some of Joe Biden's Infrastructure Reduction Act, he's paying $35 US a kilowatt hour to subsidize battery production in the US. Well, how does Canada compete with that? Well, one of the ways we compete with that is our electricity grid is so much cleaner and less carbon emitting. We have a lot of fresh water. We have a labor force that links to this. We have good skills training. So lots of kind of different ways that Canada can make up, but it all turns on the amount of clean electricity you have.
Well, continuing with our game of where BC is going to get the power, one of the obvious places, and you mentioned it, is Alberta has got we're talking about Southern Alberta here, has got the best wind and solar resources in Canada. And economists have been talking about this for years. We need more east-west electricity trade in Canada. So BC has hydro dams that can act as big batteries for intermittent power. Alberta has potential to build out huge amounts of wind and solar, intermittent power, link them together with interties, and you've got a system that works really well together. So when the sun goes down and the wind stops blowing, BC sends power, puts water through its dams and sends electricity to Alberta. During the day, when the wind is blowing and the sun is shining, Alberta sends electricity back, and BC can hold back some of that water. It doesn't have to generate at full capacity out of its hydro dams. And here's another thing, Mark. I was talking to Dr. Chris Bataille, who's an economist based in BC, and he said that firm power, like you get out of a hydro dam, is worth 3 times more than intermittent power. That's the value that, is kind of the market has assigned to it. So if all you're doing is selling, like as a BC resident, I buy power at 9.4 cents a kilowatt hour. Well, if we could get 3 times that amount, if that's the value of it, at 27 or 28 cents a kilowatt hour, why are we selling it for 9 cents? Why aren't we thinking about this smart and thinking about these new arrangements, these new building infrastructure, all of that sort of thing, so we can make the best use of the assets we have, and then take advantage of our neighboring province, which has other resources that complement ours. I don't know. Your take on that?
Fully agree. I mean, hydro has a set of legacy assets that are, world leading, and as you say, they're enormous batteries that we already use to provide power down to California when they need it. Alberta is a unique system with it's the only province in Canada that has a fully deregulated utility system. So it's very easy to stand up renewable assets in Alberta. Which other things that are interesting in Alberta is they are seizing on large grid scale batteries to go with some of these assets as they build out wind and solar. So that's going to give them that 4 to 8 hours of storage where they need it through the night. And yeah, as you say, combine that with better interties across Canada. And I think there is a recipe for success here, and there's a way forward that protects the taxpayer, protects the ratepayer, as well as gives us sufficient clean electricity to actually attract new industries to BC and foreign and direct investment, both in BC as well as across Canada.
There's a lesson to be had from California, Mark, and we'll see what you think about this. But California did not do enough. Their forward planning was inadequate. They got caught. As one of my American Economist interviews said, they just simply didn't have enough generating capacity. They had a very tiny reserve, and they got caught because they always thought they could buy from their neighbors. And then when you had a drought and a heat wave, their neighbors needed their power and then it wasn't available. And the problem with that is that approach, it's bit California already several years. But if BC does the same thing, suddenly we're going to have LNG phase 2, and we're going to have a hydrogen plant. We're going to have this and that, and we're not going to have access to the power. You don't simply throw these things up overnight. You don't build another dam. You don't even put up wind and solar farms, let alone build the interties. All of that infrastructure takes so much planning and forethought. And if we are not doing it today, we're run the risk of being short in 2030 and 2035.
Absolutely. California got caught. Ontario is getting caught right now. If you look at the amount of direct investment that they are attracting, which is a great news story, but they don't have the clean power to power all this. And in fact, now they're in a situation where they're going to have to build natural gas plants if they're not careful to make up that power deficit, which actually erodes their business case for attracting people there in the first place, which is clean power and low emissions. Quebec's in the opposite camp. Is they've got a mandate for their crown utility, Hydro-Quebec, is to actually go out and generate enough power that you can actually attract new investment. So you're right, BC is at a crux right now, and we are encouraging government to come up with an energy plan, a comprehensive energy plan that would include electricity and our natural gas assets, and look at how much energy is going to be required for BC to meet its climate targets, for BC to actually shape the economy of the future, and in a way that we can actually export power. Now, whether it's electricity into the US and Western Canadian markets, whether it's green hydrogen, in a form of ammonia, off to Asia or wherever, or whether it's other types of energy exports. But, I agree, and we have to start planning now, because even if you do things like wind and solar, which, from an infrastructure perspective are fairly straightforward to stand up, it still takes a long time to get through planning and regulatory processes.
You've raised an issue that I want to address here, because the situation in Ontario and Quebec applies to BC and Alberta. And so in Ontario, Quebec keeps looking over the border and going, we'd be happy to supply you all the power you need from our huge hydro power resources. And Ontario just turns a deaf ear. They want nothing to do with that. And in BC, it's we have our own wrinkle on that. BC and Alberta fought over the Trans Mountain Expansion pipeline. Now their, political relations are chilly. Horgan didn't want to talk to, Jason Kenney when he's the premier of Alberta. And without those kind of conversations, you can't talk about interties, because it's not a technical problem. It's a political problem. And that's a political problem that can be solved with political will and some resolve. And I'm hopeful that David Eby, now that he's just taken over as premier, maybe there's a sliver of hope that he will be more foresightful than Horgan was.
Yeah, and I think the federal government realizes that the interprovincial cooperation is a significant chunk of what needs to happen over the next couple of years. And they've stood up these regional energy tables, starting with the Atlantic provinces, trying to get the Atlantic Loop, which would bring power from Newfoundland and Labrador into Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. They have a table with BC they're working on right now. Alberta will be in a pre-election period for the next couple of months, but once a new premier arrives there, hopefully that those discussions will restart again, and we can see interties build. There's other ones between Saskatchewan and Manitoba, again, looking at, opportunities to pull electricity around where it's needed. And, Saskatchewan residents pay the highest of any province in terms of electricity rates. And, there is renewable electricity opportunities in the province, as well as the opportunity to import power from Manitoba and other places. So, yeah, it's a fascinating subject, and it's going to be an interesting couple of years.
Well, it's fascinating and it's frustrating, because the the clock is ticking. When we don't have a lot of time, and first of all, we need to have the conversation. Part of the problem is that the BC government right now is, in my opinion, if it isn't captured by BC Hydro, it relies far too heavily on BC Hydro for advice. And basically BC Hydro, you know what utility executives have told me in Canada and the US? Do not let the utility, which is practice incumbent politics. Do not don't do everything, allow the utility to do everything behind closed doors, and without, it should be open and transparent. And what has BC done? That IRP you were talking about, that was done by, a committee of economists and advisors behind closed doors of BC Hydro. And that's got to stop. I mean, there are some practices in BC and some politics that are serious impediments to doing the kinds of things that need to be done. Some of them we've talked about here. But enough of my rant. Thank you very much for this, Mark. Really appreciate it. And hopefully I'm afraid we're going to have this conversation many times in the future yet before it gets solved.
Great. Thanks again for having me.